The coffee at Rosie's. Rosie's Diner was just another stop for weary travelers, but that night, something was different. When Penny Johnson, a kind-hearted waitress, offered a simple cup of coffee to a shivering man, she had no idea she was stepping into a mystery that would change her life forever. Moments later, two men in tailored suits entered, their piercing gazes locked on the man. It was an ordinary evening at Rosie's Diner, a cozy little spot tucked into a quiet corner of bustling Denver. The diner was a modest place, with its checkered floors, red vinyl booths, and the faint hum of a jukebox playing old classics. Penny Johnson, a kind-hearted waitress with a warm smile, had been working there for almost 3 years. It wasn't a glamorous job, but it paid the bills and helped her care for her ailing grandmother. Penny had grown up in a tough neighborhood, where survival depended on grit and resilience. Over the years, she had developed a deep sense of empathy for the less fortunate. She knew what it was like to struggle, to feel invisible. That evening, the diner was unusually busy. The warm glow of the neon sign outside contrasted with the biting cold of the winter night. The smell of freshly brewed coffee and sizzling burgers filled the air. Penny moved from table to table, her feet aching, but her smile never faltering. She was used to the long hours and the occasional rude customer, but tonight, something caught her attention. Near the window, a man sat hunched over, shivering in his tattered coat. His hair was matted, his face gaunt and weathered. He looked like he hadn't eaten in days. Without a second thought, Penny poured a cup of coffee and walked over to him. "On the house," she said softly, placing the cup in front of him. The man looked up, his eyes filled with gratitude. Before he could thank her, a group of rowdy customers at the counter began to sneer. "Hey, what's this? Turning into a soup kitchen now?" One of them jeered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. The others laughed, their cruel words cutting through the diner like a knife. Penny's jaw tightened. She knew this type, people who found joy in belittling others. She could see the man shrinking under their gaze, his hands trembling as he held a coffee cup. She couldn't stand by and let this happen. Taking a deep breath, Penny walked over to the group. "If you don't have anything kind to say, you can take your food to go," she said firmly. The laughter stopped, and the men glared at her. One of them, a burly man with a mean glint in his eye, stood up and leaned toward her. "Who do you think you are? Just some waitress trying to play hero." Penny didn't back down. "I'm someone who knows how to treat people with respect. If you can't do that, you're not welcome here." The tension in the diner was palpable. For a moment, it seemed like the man might lash out, but then he muttered something under his breath, threw some cash on the counter, and stormed out. His friends followed, leaving behind an uneasy silence. Penny returned to the man at the window, her smile softening. "Don't mind them," she said. "Some people just don't know any better." The man looked up at her, tears welling in his eyes. "Thank you," he whispered. "You didn't have to do that." Penny shrugged. Everyone deserves a little kindness. As the night wore on, the diner began to empty. The man, who introduced himself as David, sat quietly, sipping his coffee. Penny noticed how fragile he looked, his cheeks hollow, his hands rough and callous. She brought him a sandwich, insisting he eat something more substantial. At first, he hesitated, but eventually hunger overcame his pride. They exchanged a few words. David mentioned he had fallen on hard times, lost his job, his home, and eventually his family. Penny listened, her heart aching for him. She had seen plenty of homeless people in the city, but something about David struck a chord deep within her. He wasn't just another face in the crowd. There was a quiet dignity about him, a sense of loss that he carried like a shadow. Just as the night seemed to settle into its usual rhythm, the door swung open. Two men in tailored suits walked in, their polished shoes clicking against the diner's worn floor. They were out of place in the modest setting, their presence commanding attention. Penny felt a shiver run down her spine as they scanned the room, their eyes landing on David. The atmosphere shifted. The men approached David's table, their expressions unreadable. One of them spoke in a low, authoritative voice. "Mr. David Harding." David froze, his face pale. I don't know what you're talking about." The other man stepped forward, his tone calm but firm. "We've been looking for you for a long time." Penny's mind raced. Who are these men, and why were they looking for David? She could feel the tension building, her instincts telling her that something was very wrong. Before David could respond, the first man reached into his pocket and pulled out a small black envelope. He placed it on the table in front of David. "This is for you. It's time." David stared at the envelope, his hands trembling. He didn't reach for it, didn't say a word. The men stood there for a moment longer before turning to leave. As they walked out, Penny felt a strange sense of foreboding. She had no idea what had just happened, but she knew one thing for sure. David's life was about to change, and so was hers. Hours passed, and the diner grew quiet again. David remained silent, staring at the envelope as if it held the weight of the world. Penny, concerned and curious, approached him. "David, who are those men? What's going on?" David finally looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and sorrow. "I don't know how to explain this," he said quietly. "But those men, they're from my past. A past I've been trying to forget." Penny's heart raced. "What do you mean? Who are you, really?" David hesitated, then sighed deeply. "I wasn't always homeless, Penny. I used to be someone important. I had a family, a career, a life that most people would envy. But I made some terrible mistakes. I lost everything, my wife, my daughter, my job. I've been running from my past for years, trying to hide from the consequences of my actions." Penny listened intently, her mind reeling from the revelation. David continued, his voice heavy with regret. "Those men, they're here to take me back to face the people I betrayed. I don't know what they want from me, but it can't be good." Penny felt a surge of sympathy for David. He was clearly a man haunted by his past, and now it had caught up to him. "You don't have to face this alone," she said softly. "I'll help you, whatever it is." David shook his head. "You don't understand, Penny. This is bigger than you or me. These men, they have power. They can ruin lives." Just as David finished speaking, the door to the diner opened again. This time, more men in suits entered, their expressions serious. Penny's heart sank as they approached David, their intentions clear. "It's time to go, Mr. Harding," one of them said. David stood up, his body trembling. He looked at Penny one last time, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered, "for everything." Before Penny could respond, the men escorted David out of the diner. She watched as they disappeared into the night, her mind racing with questions. Who was David Harding, and what had he done to warrant such a response? The next morning, Penny was still reeling from the events of the previous night. She had barely slept, her thoughts consumed by David and the mysterious men in suits. As she wiped down the counter, the door to the diner opened. A woman walked in, dressed elegantly but with a face lined with sorrow. She approached Penny, her eyes scanning the diner before settling on her. "You must be Penny," the woman said softly. Penny nodded, unsure of what to say. The woman took a deep breath. "I'm David's sister, Elizabeth." Penny's eyes widened in shock. His sister? But he never mentioned. Elizabeth interrupted gently. "David has been running from our family for years. We've been searching for him, trying to bring him back, but he's always stayed one step ahead, until last night." Penny felt a pang of guilt. "I didn't know." Elizabeth smiled sadly. "You couldn't have known. David, he's been through a lot. He made some mistakes, but he's not a bad man. He just lost his way." Penny's heart ached for David. She had only known him for a few hours, but in that short time, she had seen the kindness in him, the pain he carried. "What's going to happen to him now?" she asked. Elizabeth's expression softened. "We're going to help him. Our family has the resources to get him back on his feet, to give him the support he needs. It won't be easy, but he's not alone anymore." Penny felt a sense of relief wash over her. David had been taken from the diner, but he wasn't lost. He had people who cared about him, who were willing to help him rebuild his life. Elizabeth reached into her purse and handed Penny a small envelope. "David wanted me to give this to you. It's a letter." Penny took the envelope, her hands trembling. Elizabeth smiled and nodded before turning to leave. As Penny opened the envelope, she found a handwritten note from David. It was simple, but spoke volumes. Dear Penny, I can never thank you enough for your kindness. You saw me when no one else did, and you reminded me that there's still good in this world. I'm going to face my past now, but I'll never forget what you did for me. You gave me hope when I had none. With gratitude, David Harding. Penny smiled through her tears, feeling a sense of closure. She had defended a homeless man from harassment, and in doing so, she had touched his life in ways she could never have imagined. The men in suits may have taken David away, but they hadn't taken away the impact of her kindness. In a world that often seemed cold and cruel, Penny had made a difference, and that, she realized, was enough.